The Myth of Helter Skelter. Published by Manalaurelin Dorinays Publishing. 3274-2 Alapash Street, number 65, San Juan Capistrano, California, 92675, USA. Copyright 2012. ISBN 978-0-985-983-2-1-5. The Myth of Helter Skelter by Susan Atkins, Whitehouse. Read by me, Mariah Simic. Introduction by Susan. In the fall of 1986, I received a letter from a group of young people living in a commune in Colorado. There were about 24 of them between the ages of 18 and 26, and they wrote to tell me how cool they thought my commitment offense was. Apparently, they failed to discover that I had disavowed Charles Manson over 15 years earlier. I wrote them back explaining that nothing that happened back when I was with Charles Manson was cool. Not the drug use, not the physical abuse, and certainly not the crimes. I suggested they find more enlightening role models and heroes. Several weeks later, I received their reply. It was an envelope with nothing inside but a photograph of them all holding up a huge banner with "fuck you" written across it. Americans like their heroes to be superheroes and their villains to be supervillains. It's part of our culture, a bigger-than-life country filled with bigger-than-life characters. But real heroes are simply ordinary, fallible people who stand up for what they believe in, even when they're scared, even when they're unsure of themselves, and even when no one is watching. They aren't made of steel. And criminals are simply fallible humans who make very bad decisions in their lives. They aren't anything worth admiring. Over 35 years ago in Los Angeles, a crime took place which had been blown up to the point that it has attained mythological proportions in the minds of many people. The stories have become bigger and bigger until more people know the name of Charles Manson than that of Thurgood Marshall. That is a tragedy. This crime was not a devious, diabolical attempt to start Armageddon spawned by the mind of a supervillain, nor was it a statement about environmental injustices. It was nothing more than an ugly, needless, senseless crime which destroyed families, hurt communities, and took irreplaceable loved ones out of the lives of those who needed them. It is neither amazing or interesting. Unfortunately, the fictionalization, exaggeration, and media marketing of this crime and of the participants produces the very real risk of turning Charles Manson into a fictitious horror movie character or a comic book villain nobody really believes in. And it produces the risk of making Charles Manson a hero to misguided people who don't actually know anything about him. As 35 years come and go, in some circles it is actually debated whether Charles Manson participated in the crimes at all. With this in mind, it seems it is a good time to lay the crimes out the way I saw them back in 1969 and how I understand them now. People are intrigued by what they don't understand. And I think the fantastic nature of some of the reasons given for the crimes over the years has had the effect of making them a point of obsession. I believe if I can lay these crimes out so they are perfectly understandable, even boorishly so, maybe they will be seen as the horrific acts of brutality they were, and not as a tasteful point of interest or conversation among intelligent people. With this in mind, and as my impetus, I feel it is time to produce the book you are about to read with me. Susan Atkins, Whitehouse, 2005. Editor's note. Susan did not want to do this project. It wasn't fun for her. It wasn't fun for me either, but since I was representing her legally, I thought it was important enough to try to put it together. The district attorneys who inherited the case from Vincent Bugliosi were, year by year, deliberately misrepresenting the facts and changing the story until it was almost entirely fiction. After September 11th, 2001, the district attorneys literally started saying Manson's plan had been to help Muslims overthrow the government. By 2009, they were literally calling it a terrorist attack. In 2008, the district attorneys looked the TV cameras and the parole board straight in the eye and insisted Susan had never helped the police and that she was responsible for all the wounds inflicted on Sharon Tate. Thanks to the media, this fiction was being turned into public reality. In 2009, when we forced the DA to admit that not only was Susan not responsible for all the wounds to Sharon Tate, but in fact the California courts had determined there was no evidence to suggest Susan had ever stabbed Miss Tate, all the newspapers continued to call Susan the woman who killed Sharon Tate, with several even continuing to insist Susan was responsible for all Miss Tate's wounds. It was incredibly frustrating to discover that even when we read the court decisions and the trial transcripts out in front of the TV cameras and showed them that the district attorneys were lying to them, the media wouldn't even bother reporting it, but continued to simply repeat what the state told them to say. The myth was becoming more important than the truth. And so, this was a last resort. And I'm guessing the people who fabricated the myth for their own agenda or enrichment will simply ignore this. But at least it's here for anyone who actually wants to try to see what really happened. So, we started this project with the understanding that any intelligent, objective reader would, and should, naturally weigh Susan's uncorroborated account as suspect. It was also our hope that this book would be read by intelligent, objective readers. With this in mind, it was my intent to document and reference absolutely everything Susan said in order to produce what was hoped would be an account that is as objective as humanly possible. An effort was made to limit the references and documentation to sources that were as credible as could be found. This means the primary source for reference was Helter Skelter, the account written and published by the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi himself. This account was written and published only a couple of years after the events, and according to Mr. Bugliosi, it was taken from his notes made during the investigation and trial, which increases the chance it is not tainted by poor memory. Mr. Bugliosi defended the veracity of this account at least twice in court against civil suits. It was also produced by the very person who argued Susan should be executed, all of which makes this account the most convincing source for facts to support Susan's account. There are also occasional references to the books written by Charles Watson, Will You Die For Me? This account was also produced about 30 years ago, copyrighted 1978, and so is less likely to contain unintentional memory errors. Like Susan's own account, one might understandably question the truthfulness of Charles Watson's account, except to the extent he makes admissions against his own interest, i.e., it's hard to believe he would lie to make himself look worse. Further references are made to the book by Chaplain Ray, God's Prison Gang, in which Chaplain Ray interviewed both Susan and Charles Watson in 1975. Once again, while objective readers might question the truthfulness of statements made to exonerate themselves, it is hard to question statements made against their own self-interest. It is also a good reference when challenging the continuing claims that Susan has changed her story over the years. To this extent, I feel this is a credible reference. On occasion, there are references to things Manson himself told the writer of the book, Manson, in his own words, which was published around 1980. Softbound version, ISBN 0-8021-3024-0. This account is, at points, wildly fictionalized and self-serving. In all fairness, the biographer makes a point of stating Charles Manson appeared medicated to various degrees during the time he was being interviewed, so perhaps the fantastic parts of his story were not intentionally erroneous. In addition, a lot of his story seems prompted, which is to say, it appears Manson is responding to questions concerning either Susan or Charles Watson's earlier published accounts, and not a direct account of his own memory. It seems unlikely that, 10 years after the fact, Charles Manson's memory of the crimes would touch on the very same several moments that Susan or Charles Watson's memory did. While both of these facts make Charles Manson's account somewhat suspect, once again, to the extent Manson makes statements against his own best interest, it may once again be argued to be accurate. It is hard to see why he would lie to make himself look worse. So, to this extent, I have occasionally included citations to this work. Lastly, there are occasional citations to Susan's own 1977 book, Child of Satan, Child of God. References to Susan's own book are not made with the purpose of convincing the reader as to their truthfulness, but simply to show this is the same account Susan gave 40 years ago. This is not Susan's new version of the crimes. This heavy footnoting may become ponderous at times, and we apologize for that. But this whole book is worthless if it is not a process toward a more thorough understanding of the events associated with this terrible tragedy, an undermining of the myth surrounding these events, and a means of producing an intelligent discussion of these events. Merely producing another unverifiable and wildly speculative account of these crimes serves no purpose at all, other than to continue to hurt the families who have lost irreplaceable loved ones, and to contribute to the aggrandizement of the myth of Charles Manson. Tragedies like this shouldn't be discussed at all, unless they are discussed with a legitimate goal. That goal should be to try to see that similar tragedies do not occur in the future. James Whitehouse, 2011. Chapter 1. The Slow, Easy Road to Disaster. At the age of 13, my mother was diagnosed with inoperable cancer, and I inherited a family of 5. I would come home from junior high school and begin cooking, cleaning, and washing for my father, 2 brothers, myself, and my bedridden mother. I was also the one who had to give my mother the morphine shots as she slowly passed away over the next 12 months. Upon her death, my father increased his drinking until eventually, around my 16th birthday, he left one day and never came back, abandoning me and my younger brother to fend for ourselves. By the age of 19, I'd survived a series of nightmarish episodes to finally find a moment of stability among a group of people living in San Francisco in the counterculture environment. At the time, this was not a terrible place to be. Janis Joplin lived next door. Mama Cass of the Mamas and the Papas taught me how to make BLTs. We were not deviants. We were part of this artist subculture of the era. That brief moment of stability ended when my friend Ella Jo and I came home one day to find my place empty. My boyfriend had been arrested, and once again I found myself completely broke and on my own. After 3 long years of fighting to survive and find some stability, I was right back where I'd started. I didn't even have a place to sleep. But Ella Jo said it was okay. I could stay with her. And that's when I met a group of her friends who were all going down to Los Angeles for the summer. Ella Jo said it ought to be great. She said I'd already met one of the guys. He had an old school bus, and they were going to just pack it full of people and head off. It sounded good. It was the summer of 1967. Young people were moving around and hitchhiking about the country. I'd been in San Francisco for a year or two, and the prospect and starting over from nothing again didn't sound very compelling. How bad could a summer trip to LA be? Hindsight is always perfect. I should have stayed in San Francisco. The guy with the old school bus was, of course, Charles Manson. The story of how I got from the empty house in San Francisco to death row 4 years later is the single most personally painful story I know. I do not like remembering it, reflecting on it, or discussing it. Every year, I receive numerous requests from media organizations, college students, law enforcement agencies, and inquisitive people asking for my story, or for explanations or reflections. Most of these requests are tasteful. Most are sincere. Some are not. And every couple years, the California Parole Board invites me to relive in detail the most horrible 3 days in my life. It is only my firm conviction that talking about this now will serve the community that I am undertaking this painful and distasteful project. I think it is also important to show that big disasters do not start with a decision to create a disaster, but with a series of small, poor decisions. No one wakes up one morning and decides they're gonna run amok. One poor decision leads to a situation where you are forced to choose between 2 bad alternatives, and that decision in turn leads you deeper and deeper into a hole. C.S. Lewis once said that the surest path to hell is the slow, easy descent with no signposts, no quick turns, no indication that anything is wrong. This is as important a lesson out of this story as anything. And so, Ella Jo and I set out on a light-hearted summer trip to LA with a group of young people. Chapter 2. The Bus Ride. The bus ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles took several months, moving through the trendy counterculture enclaves along the California coast. Communes and gurus were not uncommon in 1967. Religious sects and metaphysics were accepted and applauded. Teenagers were hitchhiking across the country looking to find themselves, or to find some sort of spiritual enlightenment. One more busload of truth seekers was not even noticed. Once we arrived in Los Angeles, the journey to Spawn's movie ranch in Topanga took about a year as we bounced from one open house to another. This period of time was relatively unimportant in the context of what was to follow, except in a few notable ways. First, this was the period when I got to know most of the people who ended up associated with the crimes. Bobby Beausoleil and his friends, including Leslie Van Houten and Catherine Scher, joined the group. Patricia Krenwinkel was on the bus even before I arrived, as was Lynette Fromey. Sandra Good joined shortly afterwards. And second, once we got to Spawn Ranch, we were pretty well isolated from the rest of the world. Though it was just an hour's drive north of downtown Los Angeles, this was an insurmountable distance if you didn't have a car. In the end, this isolation made it much harder to avoid the insanity once it started, or to run, even if one had the courage. This is also the time that when I got a better idea of who Charles Manson really was. Unfortunately, I did not understand him well enough. I did not understand him the way I do today. Making a supervillain out of Charles Manson is a mistake. Claiming he is a criminal mastermind would actually be amusing if it wasn't at the price of so many lives. Most of the attention the crimes have been given over the years has been generated by how inexplicable they are. Most people who show an interest do so merely because the motivation for the crime seems so hard to fathom. People tend to attribute depth and intelligence to anything they can't understand. In truth, these crimes were an incredible bungle, an incredible series of mistakes which, once tied together, started a chain reaction which sped on, faster and faster, unstoppably, to a terrible conclusion. If I do my job right, by the end of this book, you will understand both these crimes and Charles Manson perfectly. There will be nothing that happened that won't make sense to you. You will understand Charles Manson and the crimes in a way the prosecuting attorney for the case, Vincent Bugliosi, never truly did. You will understand Charles Manson in a way that, unfortunately, few of the young people at Spawn Ranch in the fall of 1969 understood him. And you will understand him in a way that took me losing my freedom and 36 years of my life to understand him. The 2.5 years I had the misfortune to live around Charles Manson was longer than almost any of the people who stayed with him. Unlike most of the young people moving about the country in the late 60s, I didn't have a family to go back to. Unlike the prodigal son, I couldn't hitchhike across the country, sow my wild oats, express my youthful rebelliousness, and return home when I became tired and disillusioned. By the time I realized what was happening, I was stuck. But it means I was there to see the entire thing develop. I was there to see why it happened. So this story comes from someone who saw more of Charles Manson than most of the people he associated with. Someone who told the police Charles Manson was responsible for the crimes. And someone who has spent the last 36 years avoiding his disciples, ignoring his threats, and burning his hate mail. In short, I found out more about Charles Manson than anyone would want to, and in the hardest way. Maybe this book will allow some of you to avoid repeating my mistakes. Perhaps the best place to start is with a better understanding of Charles Manson himself. There is a tendency to simply assume that people in prison for murder are murderers because there is something in them that isn't like the rest of us. That's a very reassuring notion. It sets a very clear line between us and the people we think of as bad. The problem is that you end up believing people who kill do so because they're murderers on the inside. And the proof that they are murderers on the inside is the fact that they killed someone. This doesn't leave any real room for intelligent understanding of the factors that lead to crime. The real question is what led to these crimes? What led to so many horrifically bad decisions? Why were these crimes orchestrated? What did anyone hope to gain from them? Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi stated that there is no such thing as a motiveless crime. It is an animal that doesn't exist. I believe this is true. Psychologists sometimes speak of sociopaths. Sociopaths, if they really exist, could be explained as people who don't understand that other people are people. That is to say, they don't really understand on an emotional level that you and I have the same needs and wants that they do. They may understand that you and I are people on an intellectual level. In fact, that is usually the source of a great deal of their ability to manipulate others. But this intellectual understanding doesn't affect them. Most of us couldn't steal candy from a baby. Most of us couldn't call someone up and tell them their child had been harmed. We understand what an emotional trauma that would be, and we associate with it so closely that it would cause us incredible emotional pain to put another person through that. According to psychologists, a sociopath wouldn't make that association. He would understand that people would get upset about their child being harmed, but he wouldn't identify with the emotional pain at all. This means a sociopath would be able to be incredibly manipulative because he wouldn't feel any remorse about hurting people. Charles Manson may be a sociopath, or he may be simply someone who was so badly abused growing up that he had to learn to turn off that part of himself. Perhaps his emotional responses were beaten out of him. Or perhaps excessive use of drugs led to paranoia, which caused him to develop imaginary enemies who were trying to harm him, blunting any human sympathy he might have had for them. Psychologists still argue over how to separate true sociopaths. Those who truly don't have a concept of other people as anything other than objects, and those who simply no longer care about the needs and rights of others. There is a tendency to say that anyone who does a heinous crime is a sociopath because they obviously had no feelings for the hopes and dreams of their victims. But this is a mistake. Almost always, you will find that these are people who were hardened and embittered to the point they no longer cared about anything, not even their own life. But they still had a concept of other people as human beings. Considerable media attention has been given to Charles Manson's ability to control the minds of his followers, his ability to brainwash people, hypnotize, zombie-ize. But if you look at his methods of controlling people, you will see no mystic clairvoyance, no unearthly superpower. What you will see is that he knows no more about brainwashing than any other pimp in Los Angeles. He took young people, primarily girls, who had poor family relations, low self-esteem, and who felt they didn't belong. He took them away from all their familiar surroundings. He took them to an isolated place where he could control what they saw, heard, and learned. He prevented them from making any attachments outside his group. He took away all their money under the pretext that the family would provide for them, which not only prevented them from leaving, but also made them dependent on him, even for clothes, food, and shelter. He sowed dissension and bitterness toward outsiders. He encouraged them to become dependent on drugs which he alone would disperse. And then, to polish it all off, he threw in a sizable portion of brutal physical abuse. I think most people would be surprised to learn that Charles Manson's brainwashing often took form of beating a teenage girl to the point she was bloodied and screaming when she didn't do what he wanted. Diane Lake was 14 when 35-year-old Manson broke a chair over her head for talking when she wasn't supposed to. When Mary Bruner tried to take her son away from the family, she was beaten so badly she couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. Often, Charles Manson's mind control took an even crueler turn. When Linda Kasabian wanted to leave Spawn Ranch after the Cielo and LaBianca murders, her daughter was moved away from the ranch to a secluded place surrounded by armed thugs. Charles Manson claimed the children were being protected, but in reality, they were being held as security to prevent their mothers from leaving. The obvious message was that Charles Manson was in complete control of the children's lives. This is the same type of persuasion which helped contribute to my decision to recant my grand jury testimony and confess that Charles Manson had nothing to do with the murders. Charles Manson sent his followers to suggest that it might be better for me and my son if I decided not to testify against him. This type of cruelty has nothing to do with mind control. It takes no special powers to threaten and brutalize teenagers and young adults. This is not a very impressive achievement, and Charles Manson deserves no awe or respect for it. Such brutality does, however, take a special type of person. And Charles Manson was a social person. He is not a loner or an isolationist. He has to have people around him. Such a need is sometimes the sign of someone extremely insecure about themselves. It can also be the sign of someone with extremely low self-esteem. Both are probably true for Charles Manson. His insecurity probably shows through in his belief that he had to mirror back at people what he thought they wanted to see. His low self-esteem probably shows through in his need to degrade, brutalize, and control weaker people around him. Charles Manson is also a con man. He will constantly try to get you to underestimate him. He will try to make you feel sorry for him. He will tell you how bad life has been to him and how rough his upbringing was. That his mother didn't want him. That his teachers were mean to him. That society withdrew from him. He will tell you that fate itself and nothing else pushed him to the place he is now. But that is just a learned con. It is not true. Charles Manson had everything. At one time, he had almost 20 young girls taking care of him. He hobnobbed with the Beach Boys and attended Hollywood parties with musicians and movie stars. He lived for free off the generosity of soft-hearted people who believed in him, like Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, and off the hard work of the young girls who took him in. He never once had a job in the 3 years he was out of jail. Free drugs, free sex, famous people around him. He lived a dream life. He was offered everything America could offer a single man in the late 1960s. And he had it in the most hedonistic city in the country, Los Angeles. Society gave Charles Manson so many opportunities to make good. Hollywood forgave his sexual debauchery with underage girls. Los Angeles forgave his drug use. The music industry and the counterculture overlooked his prison time. Charles Manson was finally rejected by society, not, as he likes to tell it, because they were cruel and worldly establishment people who didn't want to get off his back. Charles Manson was finally rejected by society because he was a manipulative user who abused the people who tried to be nice to him. Everyone who ever tried to help Charles Manson was ultimately made a fool for their troubles. Dennis Wilson, who claimed to have spent as much as $100,000 on Manson, was threatened with the death of his son when he finally cut the money off. Terry Melcher, who tried to sell Manson's music to the industry, was targeted for murder when none of the offers came through. Gary Hinman, who had donated food and clothing to feed Manson's own baby son, was murdered when he wouldn't give Manson money. Sandra Good's father helped support Charles Manson after his daughter joined the family and was threatened when he wouldn't give more. And perhaps cruelest of all, save only the murder of Gary Hinman, a whole group of young people who looked up to and trusted Manson as a leader and guide were ultimately misled, used, and then either thrown away or left to die. I don't speak so much for myself, but for the younger kids at the ranch back in 1969. The young runaways who, thanks to Charles Manson, were fed a mouthful of bitterness toward the law and society, and then pulled into auto theft, drug dealing, stealing, burglarizing, and for some, a life of crime and addictions they would never overcome. So, if Charles Manson had it tough, it was his own doing. Life gave him everything, and he spit it back in society's face. In hindsight, I've come to believe the most prominent character trait Manson displays is that of a manipulator. Not a guru, not a metaphysic, not a philosopher, not an environmentalist, not a sociologist or a social activist, and not even a murderer. His long-term behavior is one predominantly of a practiced manipulator. But this analysis is all from an intellectual level, and it has taken me years and years to be able to see Charles Manson like this. On an emotional level, I could have told you about Charles Manson 36 years ago. He is a liar, a con artist, a physical abuser of women and children, psychological and emotional abuser of human beings, a thief, a dope pusher, a kidnapper, a child stealer, a pimp, a rapist, and a child molester. I can attest to all of these things with my own eyes, and he was all of these things before he was a murderer. Chapter 3. The Error. So how did the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, make the mistake of concluding that Helter Skelter, a black-white race war that would bring on Armageddon, was the motive for the murders of the LaBiancas and those at 10,050 Cielo Drive? The most obvious reason is that Mr. Bugliosi didn't look at the events that led up to these murders in chronological order. If you don't study what happened in the order it happened, how can you ever understand why one occurrence followed another? Did Charles Manson simply wake up one day and say, "Somebody's gonna die today"? Mr. Bugliosi gives that impression in his version of the crime. But what Mr. Bugliosi doesn't answer satisfactorily is why it happened. Mr. Bugliosi says the murders were planned to bring about Helter Skelter, but Vincent Bugliosi also claimed that Charles Manson already believed Helter Skelter was imminent. So why would he risk his life to try to set it off himself? Charles Manson went to a great deal of trouble to avoid responsibility for the murders. He tried to get others to do the killing for him. He tried to distance himself from the places where the murders took place. He ran to the desert. He set up alibis. He set up armed guards around himself and his camp. He did not want to be caught. And it wasn't that he didn't understand the consequences of his actions. He knew very well what would happen if he was caught. So, if Helter Skelter was already imminent, why did he take such terrible risks? It just doesn't make sense. And when things don't make sense, it generally means that you haven't got the story quite right. If Charles Manson thought Helter Skelter was imminent, and if his elaborate efforts indicated just how desperately he didn't want to get caught, why would he still go ahead and arrange for people to get murdered? He wouldn't. Something else provoked this rash act. And as we go through the events that led to those 2 nights in August 1969, you will begin to see exactly how a long line of interrelated events produced this crime. And only then will you begin to understand the true tragedy of the horrible loss of life that ensued. But for now, it is worth pointing out, in Mr. Bugliosi's defense, Tate-LaBianca trial was rushed from the start due to the incredible amount of public pressure the Los Angeles Police Department was under. The grand jury was held before the district attorney's office had any real evidence on anyone, except for my testimony. Because of this, Mr. Bugliosi was forced into the case much quicker than he would have liked. He had to come up with a way to convict Charles Manson for crimes of which Mr. Bugliosi knew he was responsible for, but for which Charles Manson had been very careful to distance himself from. This began what might be called the hunt for the magic motive. This is to say, the hunt for anything that would convince a jury that Charles Manson and Charles Manson alone was the beneficiary of these murders. In his book, Mr. Bugliosi points out that the motive is not the prosecuting attorney's job to establish. But this case was different. If no motive was established here, there would be no way of convicting Charles Manson. And so, Mr. Bugliosi jumped in as any young, ambitious attorney would have, and began digging around. But he didn't find out that the murder of Gary Hinman was connected to Bernard Crowe until well after the grand jury. How could he possibly uncover the real motive for the murders of those at the Cielo and LaBianca homes without understanding the real reason for Gary Hinman's death? He couldn't. It wasn't until the trial started that Vincent Bugliosi finally found out about the suspected murder of Bernard Crowe. This suspected murder would have an incredible effect on the actions of Charles Manson. But by the time Vincent Bugliosi discovered it, he was already selling Helter Skelter to a jury. To have tried to change the purported motive at that point would have cost him his credibility in a case in which he was already stretching his credibility to the limit. So Vincent Bugliosi went on with Helter Skelter. To his credit, and a testament to his hard work, he won convictions and death sentences. But the misrepresentation of the motive has had some disturbing side effects. The most disturbing, as far as I'm concerned, is the raising of Charles Manson to the status of a mystic, mind-controlling supervillain. The attention he has received as a result of his conviction is not what is deserved. The second disturbing side effect of the Helter Skelter myth is that it allows several of those who were involved with Charles Manson at the time of the murders and a whole new generation of misguided youth to delude themselves as to what these murders were really about. They were not revolutionary or environmental symbolic killings. They were the completely unnecessary murders of innocent people. People with loved ones, families, friends, dreams, and hopes just like the rest of us. And all for the basest and most arrogant of causes, the serving of Charles Manson's self-interest. Chapter 4. First Appetite. By the fall of 1969, Charles Manson had as many as 40 people living with him at Spahn Ranch. I often hear it asked, why did people flock to this obviously abusive and oppressive deviant? Why did those who stayed feel drawn to his murder cult? How could those involved with Charles Manson deliberately draw more people into his nightmarish web of fear and hatred? These are the types of questions you hear posed by those who look back from a point in time after 1970. For them, it seems impossible to believe that the commune wasn't steeped in murder and revolution from the start. But it wasn't. Without knowing the whole story of what led up to the murders and the fall of '69, it's very easy to doubt that an ordinary hippie commune preaching love and music and drugs could be transformed into what the family became. It's very easy, without knowing what happened, to insist the family must have always been a dark, bitter, twisted, and homicidal group. But that's not true. The family started as something very different, and then it changed. It was only over a relatively short period of time that it became what the media shows you today. But to understand this long road, you must understand how it began. In 1967, Charles Manson was released into Los Angeles after spending the last 7 years of his life in federal prison. His interests upon leaving prison were few: sex and drugs. The day after his release, he transferred his parole to San Francisco, where the new hippie movement and free love promised both. Charles Manson must have been in heaven once he turned loose in San Francisco. Years of learning how to manipulate and con, as well as years of studying pseudo-religions, paid off in spades. San Francisco was filled with young, naive, idealistic, and impressionable kids just looking for someone to show them a new way. And they were willing to throw themselves into any new experience or idea wholeheartedly, forsaking everything else. In 1967, Charles Manson could talk New Age religion. Charles Manson could talk old religion. Charles Manson knew Eastern religious thought. Charles Manson had the vision and intensity necessary to hold the attention of young minds. He understood psychology. He understood nihilism. He gave the appearance of having forsaken his worldly possessions and dropped out of the rat race. In truth, this appearance was simply because he left prison with very little, and even less to give up. He appeared to live what he preached. And what did Charles Manson want? What was he after? Sex and drugs. These were available everywhere in the hippie counterculture. They were practically given away. So Charles Manson strung together a little pseudo-religious, pseudo-intellectual mumbo-jumbo, along with his ability to play guitar, and he was in. The 35-year-old con man became a peace-loving hippie and began hanging around the parks and universities. And he used this new con to get what he wanted. So why did young people flock to him? Because in 1967, pseudo-spiritual sermons with a vaguely Eastern feel to them were what people wanted to hear. And Charles Manson was an expert at telling people what they wanted to hear. Years of learning how to mimic and ingratiate himself to other inmates in prison had taught him how to draw out people's opinions and attitudes and project these back at them. Why weren't these young people able to see through his con? Because drugs and sex were things that were shared casually in the underground. Nobody but Charles Manson would have perceived these things as something you had to cheat people out of. So, when people ask how members of the family could have ever been attracted to Charles Manson, the true answer often shocks and offends them. In 1967, there was no reason to fear Charles Manson. He wasn't preaching murder. He was preaching love and peace. Not out of any belief in these necessarily, but as a way of getting what he wanted. There was no reason to avoid Charles Manson in 1967. People often ask why members of the family stayed with Charles Manson. Once again, the answer is often received with incredible disbelief. Until the summer of 1969, there was no reason to run from Charles Manson. He could get what he wanted by playing the part of the pacifist hippie guru. No one suspected that this facade hid an all-encompassing and violently dangerous self-interest. And yes, if you had been searching for something in San Francisco or Los Angeles in the late 60s, and you had run into Charles Manson, he would have told you whatever it was that you wanted to hear, and you would have been taken in. You would have thought he was a great guy. You would have thought he shared your beliefs and your understanding of the world, and you thought you could trust him. If you were searching for something in San Francisco or Los Angeles, or anywhere up and down the West Coast, as many of us were in those times, and you did not end up with Charles Manson, it was only by God's good grace, and not by any better judgment of your own. But it's hard for people to believe this. And I understand that. It's very frightening to accept that if you had been there, something like the family could have grown up right around you with your having any forewarning. It is much more comforting to believe that something this horrible could not have been born without the knowledge and participation of those around. It is much more comforting to believe that there must have been obvious signs from the beginning. There must have been some reason this did not begin, just like every other commune experimenting with drugs and free sex at the time. It's frightening to believe that, but for the love of God, you weren't pulled into that nightmare as well. It is much more appealing to convince yourself that those who ended up there were somehow different from the rest of the young kids on the West Coast in the late 60s. That somehow they must have been intrinsically evil to end up where they did. That they had a taste for Charles Manson's bitter preachings. That you could have avoided Charles Manson. That you would have seen through his cons. But you couldn't have. In 1967, Charles Manson's needs and interests were so nominal he didn't seem any more manipulative or dangerous than the boy next door. All he wanted was a little sex and drugs. There were no bitter preachings about hate killing and pigs. There was no need. Charles Manson could get all he wanted by copying and mirroring the love and peace rhetoric of the day. And he did it well. His years as a pimp and a con man had taught him to say what people around him wanted to hear, and to say it convincingly. Very few people who met Charles Manson during this period weren't attracted to him. Even his parole officer, who was very familiar with ex-convicts and their manipulations, was taken in by Manson. Most of those who heard Charles Manson speak stayed with him. Those who escaped the nightmare to come did so not due to their better judgment, but because they were lucky enough to be left behind when the family moved from place to place. I, unfortunately, was not one of those who was left behind. Chapter 5. The Hustle at Spahn Ranch. The movement of the family to Los Angeles was the beginning of Charles Manson's manipulation, no longer just for sex and drugs, but for control of the people around him. Having satiated himself with the fruits of the free love counterculture that had been denied him for so long while in prison, his goals were raised. He now wanted more. This is also the point in the story when I personally become involved. A pimp has to know how to control people, especially women, especially young women. Absolute control is essential if you want to make someone do something that is personally repugnant to them. The first rule of controlling people to this extent is to remove the people you want to manipulate from all familiar surroundings and support. This not only makes them dependent on the you for everything, it means if they begin to have misgivings, there is nowhere to turn. And there is no one around to reinforce their own inner feeling that things aren't the way they should be. Charles Manson knew this. Not only is this a basic manipulative tool, he'd had practice. He'd been a pimp at one time in his checkered past. Once he settled at Spawn Ranch in Los Angeles, Charles Manson's wants and needs reached even higher. He had men to get him money and drugs and to do his dirty work. He had women for sex and to take care of him. But this wasn't enough. He'd seen the fruits of fame. He wanted power. He now sought social acceptance. The story of this ill-fated music career is not a unique one. Only 1 in 1,000 make it in music, maybe less. But this was an incredible blow to a man who actually thought he was the only thing that mattered in the universe. The piquing of his pride can only be imagined. But Manson's brush with fame, the Beach Boys and the Hollywood crowd, drew even more people to Charles Manson's family during this time. And there was still no reason for them not to be drawn in. It was basically the same sermon he'd been using in San Francisco, only there were more kids and fewer counterculture gurus to compete with in Los Angeles. Charles Manson became better at telling his stories, learning what best held the interests and imaginations of the idealistic youths. And as the family grew, a hierarchy developed. Those who pleased Charles Manson were given more preferential treatment, thus allowing him to increase his control over them. But this was probably no different from any other commune based on a single leader. Some move closer to him and therefore benefit from increased acceptance. Others find themselves on the outside and so work harder to get back in. This might be a good point in the story to explain that I was never on the inside. I was always an outsider. Because of my abusive upbringings, I had a natural aversion to authority. And ironically, even though Charles Manson preached against societal authority, the more control he took of the family, the more he became the authority. Charles Manson and I always had a personality clash. I didn't like being told what to do, and he demanded that people did what he told them. At the time, I thought that meant he was strong. I thought it meant he couldn't be dissuaded from his beliefs. He said he liked me, and I thought he did. But when I wanted something, he never gave it to me. Other men I'd known always tried to give me whatever I wanted in relationships. Charles Manson didn't. In hindsight, I now understand it simply meant he didn't care in the least for anyone's interests except his own. He told me he liked me simply because that was a way to control me, a way to get me to contribute to the family. 2 years later, during the trial, when he made me and my co-defendants get on the stand and say that we planned the murders in a bid to allow him to escape the death penalty, thereby assuring our own executions, I discovered just how much he really cared about me. One would expect to find great clues to the turning of the family during this period, as this is the year or so that directly preceded the crimes. But There were no obvious signs that things were changing from the peace and love sermons in San Francisco. There were clues, but they were very subtle. The influx of new family members was one of these changes. It was nothing alarming of itself, but it did mean that a group mentality was forming. It also meant it was easier to pretend everything that happened among us was all right, and there was reassurance in numbers. Also, the slow decline into crime would eventually be cushioned and anesthetized by the fact that everyone around you was participating, so it didn't seem out of the ordinary. The development of the hierarchy was another. The hierarchy was a little more profound. It changed Charles Manson from simply a New Age spiritual leader to the person who influenced everything that was done around Spahn Ranch. From the clothes you wore to the way you wore your hair, the merest comment from Manson sent people scurrying to please him. In the end, it was his ability to simply do no more than suggest something be done to make it happen that led to his erroneous belief that he couldn't be held responsible for the crimes. He was wrong. But at the beginning, the change was slow and the effect was not yet obvious in late 1968 and early 1969. Another change was the beginning of revolutionary talk. This was the beginning of the talk of Helter Skelter. The notion of a black-white race war was, of course, something Charles Manson had picked up in prison. That it began to come out more and more often was an indicator of the things being said by the young people who began joining the family during this time. A consummate manipulator, Charles Manson simply parroted back at people what they wanted to hear. With the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965 and the growing fervor over Vietnam, revolution was a popular catchphrase for snaring the young, the idealistic, and the unwanted. And so Charles Manson sewed together several disjointed ideas and began to construct a tale so incredible and fanciful that it could hold the attention of even the most drug-enfeebled teenage mind. And the story of Helter Skelter was born. That Charles Manson's Helter Skelter story was around will not be disputed. That he used it to manipulate the young people around him is abundantly obvious. But the contention that this had any relation to the true motive for the murders will slowly become ridiculous as the events are unfolded. In his new quest for power, Charles Manson went out of his way to ensnare the lost and unwanted young. This is another indicator of his expertise in manipulation. They were the easiest to control. They had no one else to turn to. He, being an unwanted child himself, knew how to play on their inner bitterness and fear and longing to be accepted. But this might also be an oversimplification. Charles Manson tried to snare anyone he could. That he was more successful with the outcasts among society probably had little to do with his choice and more to do with the fact that outcasts had few other options open to them. As an example, by the time of the crimes, I had no family or friends left to turn to. My mother had passed away when I was 14. My father had abandoned my brother and me and gone off drinking when I was 16. My aunt kicked me out of her house when I was 18 because she caught my cousin drinking and was positive I was responsible. And my grandparents wouldn't speak to me after I had a child out of wedlock. Any friends I had before moving to Los Angeles were lost. Any friends I made in Los Angeles were harassed by the family until they either joined or were scared away. By 1969, I had nowhere in the world to go outside of Spahn Ranch. If I had left in early 1969, I would have left with my son and no friends, no family, no money, no food, and literally only the clothes I was wearing. By late 1969, even this meager chance would be eliminated, and those who left were lucky to leave with their lives. Probably the most important change in the family that took place during the year or so before the murders is also the least mentioned. That is the increase in drug use. Drug use tends to produce an ever-increasing appetite. Once you start, you slowly become conditioned to them, and you progressively need more and more drugs to feel the high you did the first time you tried them. This is a very subtle thing, and in 1968, it was not much cause for alarm, but Charles Manson was becoming hooked. His initial interest in a career in music faded in part because of the spurn he felt he received from the music industry, but also because his wants were changing. The family was growing daily in Los Angeles. Arriving with only 7 members, by the time he settled at Spahn Ranch, the family sometimes reached up to as many as 40 people, counting the hangers-on. Just providing enough food became a project. You can imagine what the expenses for drugs were. And for Charles Manson, this became a very important consideration. By the summer of 1969, most expenses at Spahn Ranch were financed by drug deals and auto theft. All activity around Charles Manson and the men he trusted concerned procuring drugs or money for drugs. Drugs had been one of Charles Manson's primary tools for manipulating people ever since blending into the San Francisco underground. But now, I believe they had a hold of him. The extent to which this is true can be seen in accounts of life at Spahn Ranch during the time. Sandra Good was reported to have given Charles Manson thousands of dollars upon joining the family. Linda Kasabian confessed to stealing $5,000 and giving it to the family. Juanita donated over $10,000 in her van, turning it all over to Charles Manson. And poor Dennis Wilson estimated he spent close to $100,000 on Charles Manson during the several months he provided for the family. And where did this money go? The family didn't pay rent anywhere it lived. The family ate day-old food discarded from supermarkets. The family borrowed and later began to steal cars when it needed them. Except for drugs and later guns, there were no expenses at all for the family. I believe it was this reliance on drugs and the money drugs brought in that began the cycle that led several months later to the murders of at least 9 people. The main problem about dealing drugs is also the most obvious. They're illegal. Being illegal, if you decide to pursue this vocation, there is no better business bureau to turn to if you feel you've been cheated. And you will run into many people who are less than honorable. Charles Manson and the men in the family began buying and then carrying guns. The accounts given of life at Spahn Ranch tend to bear out the statement that guns appeared, not with the event of Helter Skelter, but with the increased dealings with drug pushers and dealers. The fact is, Charles Manson spoke of a black-white race war as far back as San Francisco, and there weren't any guns at all at that time. They weren't needed. What you have building up is a recipe for disaster. An ever-increasing appetite for an illegal substance that pushes Charles Manson further and further into illegal means of obtaining it. Robberies and swindles were performed, sometimes including very dangerous drug burns, and all to obtain more and more money for drugs. By the summer of 1969, family members were encouraged to steal from their friends and even burglarize their parents' homes to make up for this drug deficit. And the best part about all this as far as Charles Manson was concerned, was that they were giving him the money, and he didn't even have to get near the crimes. He thought he was faultless because he hadn't actually gone out and stole the money himself. This was a pattern he would try to use again later. Charles Manson had long ago adopted the communist idea of shared property among the members of the family. But here, once again, you can see the true motive. He told new indoctrinates they had to give up all worldly wealth and possessions to be truly free. But they had to give these worldly possessions and wealth up to Charles Manson. And also he could dress in expensive leathers and maintain his psychotic drug state, while the rest of us ate food out of dumpsters. But how we fared didn't matter to Charles Manson. In his accounts of those days, Manson is fond of stating everything he did was done for those kids. The truth is, he didn't do anything for the young people around him except live off them, brutalize them, molest them, and introduce them to criminal life. The extent to which he cared for the young people around him can be seen in the fact that he led several of us to California's death row just to satisfy his own petty wants. But by far, the most important change that happened during this period, as far as I was concerned, was the birth of my son on October 3rd, 1968. Though born 2 months premature and only weighing 1.5 pounds, he was absolutely wonderful. He was the only good thing that happened to me during that entire part of my life. But the good could not outweigh the bad. The hustle was taking its toll. During the summer of 1969, you could see the house of cards beginning to shake. Everything at Spawn Ranch was by the skin of your teeth. Just barely getting enough food, finding replacement clothes, getting the money Charles Manson demanded, just barely getting the drugs everyone had been waiting for. And to cover up this shadow of impending doom, there developed an almost hysterical flippancy, a rebellious devil-may-care attitude, almost a fatalism about it all. If just one little thing went wrong. Chapter 6. The House Fell. When a house of cards teeters, one can only hold one's breath. And when the house finally collapses, it goes down fast. From bad to worse. Already in a bind for money and feeling the bite of the local police, whose attention he wasn't able to avoid due to the ever-increasing numbers of underage runaways that flocked to Spawn Ranch, Manson was under an increasing amount of pressure. In addition, the local bikers who were once friends were beginning to resent Manson for pulling their members away, and they had actually threatened him several times. It was in the middle of this already tense situation that Manson started pressuring everyone more and more for money. There are some indications Manson was already thinking of moving away in order to avoid the growing problems with police and bikers, and had sent people to scout in the desert. But in order to move, he needed more money, and everyone was pushed more and more to this end. This is when the Crowe incident happened. Bernard Crowe was a black drug dealer in the San Fernando Valley. What apparently happened, though neither I nor any of the others were privy to this at the time, was that in response to Manson's pressure, Charles Watson had orchestrated a drug deal with Bernard Crowe. Apparently, Watson convinced Crowe to give him the drugs, leaving his fiancée behind as security. Watson apparently told Crowe he would sell the drugs to a waiting buyer, and then return immediately with the money. But this isn't what happened. I should mention that Charles Watson had taken a drug concocted by boiling hallucinogenic seeds earlier in the week, and he wasn't himself during this whole episode. He'd disappear for long periods of time, or sit comatose for hours and have to be hand-fed. I don't know what he'd taken, but I remember it really messed him up. This may have been a very strong effect on what ended up happening. Another thing worth noting is that the girl wasn't really his fiancée. He'd only just met her, and apparently he decided to abandon her and run off with the drugs. Unfortunately, the girl had heard Watson called Spawn Ranch earlier, as she remembered the phone number. When Watson didn't come back, Bernard Crowe began pressuring the girl, as she gave him the number she'd seen Watson call. Crowe called and asked for Charles, but Charles Watson was known as Tex at Spawn Ranch. There was only one Charles, and that was Charles Manson. When Manson answered the phone, Crowe told him he was a Black Panther, which wasn't true, and he knew where Manson was, and if Manson didn't come down and give him his money, he and all his Black Panther buddies were going to make a raid at Spawn Ranch and kill everyone there. It's worth looking at the incident that followed, the Crowe incident, a little closer, because it is the true beginning of the terrible panicked spiral that led to the deaths of 9 innocent people. Though Charles Manson had never even heard of Bernard Crowe, it was immediately obvious that 1. Bernard Crowe knew who he was. This was a mistake in identification, but Charles Manson never figured this out. 2. Bernard Crowe knew where Charles Manson lived. And 3. Bernard Crowe was mad. To Charles Manson, this was no small problem. There was no way he could run from the police, the bikers, and the Panthers. He was broke. So he had to deal with Bernard Crowe one way or another. If he couldn't con Bernard Crowe, Charles Manson believed the only way to prevent the Panthers from getting his name and whereabouts was to eliminate the source, Bernard Crowe. If something happened to Crowe, no one would be around to tell the Panthers anything. But either way, it had to be done quick. And so Charles Manson told Bernard Crowe he would meet with him and straighten the whole thing up. Manson got a gun and took one of the early members of the family, a young man named T.J. Wallerman, and he went down into the San Fernando Valley. The account given by T.J. later was that Charles Manson placed the gun in the back of his belt so that it wouldn't be visible as he walked towards Crowe. The plan was that if Manson wasn't able to talk his way out of the situation, when they got close enough, Manson would signal T.J., who was supposed to pull out the gun and shoot Bernard Crowe. This plan for killing Bernard Crowe gives a perfect insight into Charles Manson. He set up the meeting. He arranged how it was to be carried out. And the arraignment was that if the dealer threatened him, he'd get an innocent person to take the fall for killing Crowe. TJ was a member of the family that Manson professed a willingness to die for. One of your brotherhood, as he put it, a friend. And yet Charles Manson tried to get T.J. Wallerman to kill Bernard Crowe. This is the same basic tactic he would use later. But this wasn't the way it happened. According to the prosecutor, when Manson got to Bernard Crowe's apartment, there were several of his friends there. Manson tried to smooth-talk him. But when that didn't work and an altercation became inevitable, Manson signaled TJ to pull the gun. But TJ's better sense prevailed, and he refused to pull the gun out of the back of Manson's belt. This left Manson standing all alone in the middle of Bernard Crowe's living room in a predominantly black neighborhood, facing what he thought were several Black Panthers and one angry dope dealer who'd just been ripped off. Manson was forced to pull the gun himself. He shot Bernard Crowe right in the chest. Crowe fell to the ground and lay still. Manson and TJ ran. Later, Bernard Crowe told police he'd played dead until Manson left and then got to a hospital. His friends had made sure Manson thought Crowe had been killed, probably to prevent Manson from coming back looking to complete the job. By the grace of God, Bernard Crowe did not die, though according to the prosecutor's account, he was on the critical list for over 2 weeks. When questioned by police at the time of the shooting, Crowe insisted he didn't know who shot him. One can only imagine he was more interested in taking care of Charles Manson himself when he got well. It may be educating to look at the account that Manson himself gives of the events surrounding his attempted murder of Bernard Crowe. Charles Manson claims he went to Bernard Crowe's house not to kill him, but to protect this mystery girl, who Charles Manson claims Bernard Crowe holding hostage until he got his money. According to Manson, it was TJ who decided to bring the gun with them. Once at the house, Bernard Crowe attacked Charles Manson, and in defense of his own life and the honor and virtue of this mystery girl, who Manson had never seen before, Charles Manson shot Bernard Crowe down while Crowe had him by the neck. This version of the story sounds nothing like the versions told by anyone else, and is so ridiculous it really has to be read to be believed. At one point, Charles Manson claims to have got down on his knees in front of Bernard Crowe and begged for the life of the girl, actually saying at one point, "If you have to kill someone, then take me and let her go." That Charles Manson, the accomplished manipulator, ended up having to pull the gun and shoot Crowe himself, is a testament to how foolish a position he'd put himself in. He had obviously thought he could get TJ to take care of his dirty work for him. That it hadn't worked and he'd had to dirty his hands infuriated Charles Manson. He was so angry and abusive to TJ when they got back to Spahn Ranch that TJ, a longtime member of the family and a friend, left in the middle of the night out of fear for his life. The irony was that Charles Manson had thought he could keep his identity hidden from the Panthers by silencing Crowe quickly. But Bernard Crowe had been with friends when Charles Manson arrived. As Charles Manson ran from the apartment a few moments later, he believed that now, not only did the Panthers believe it was he who had ripped off Crowe, they would soon find it was he who had killed one of their brothers. When Charles Manson returned to Spahn Ranch that night, he still had to worry about where he was going to raise money for more drugs, and where he was going to make his connections, and whether the police were getting ready to move in on him over the auto thefts and underage kids at the ranch. On top of all that, he now had to worry about a murder charge and the prospect of being arrested. Probably more disturbing to him that night was the prospect of retaliation by the Panthers for Crowe's death. That would not be good. Chapter 7. Running and Money. It must have been obvious to Charles Manson that if he wanted to live, he had to get away from Spahn Ranch. If Bernard Crowe had found him there, then anyone could find him there, especially Crowe's friends. But moving takes money. And the whole reason the family had ended up in the old, dilapidated, fly-ridden movie ranch was because money was scarce. Except, of course, for drugs. Charles Manson needed still more money. He needed it immediately. But that's exactly how he had got into this mess in the first place. Barker Ranch, out in Death Valley, had been located earlier in the year, maybe as early as late 1968. It had originally been considered as a home for the family, when it looked as though things at Spahn Ranch weren't going well. Charles Manson loved the desert, but the problem of just reaching the isolated ranch, let alone moving in enough food and supplies to feed the expanding family, kept this move from being actualized. Now, it looked as though this might be the answer to Charles Manson's problems. No one would be able to find him there. But Charles Manson was not going by himself. He needed gunmen and women to do chores for him. But in order to move the entire family, he desperately needed money. And now, Chapter 8, The Lie That Wouldn't Die. Believing he had murdered Bernard Crowe, Charles Manson became frantic. He had, through his undying self-centeredness and an incredible underestimation of TJ's integrity, put himself in a position where he had dirtied his own hands. Immediately, he had two huge additional problems. The first was that many of the people in and around Spahn Ranch knew he had gone to see Crowe. That meant there were probably a dozen people who could corroborate any accusation against him. It was an incredible blunder for a boastful career criminal. Even among his loyal family, he must have felt as though a rope was coiling around his neck. And so he came up with a plan to protect himself from the very people he claimed he was willing to give his life for. We'll get to that later. The second problem was much more subtle. Charles Manson needed people around him. He needed the women for sex, to make him feel important, to do chores for him, and to draw men into the family. He needed men to deal his drugs, make his connections, rob and steal to raise money, and now for protection. But he could hardly admit he had just killed a Black Panther and the entire Brotherhood of Black Panthers was about to come screaming into Spahn Ranch to wipe us all out. If he had said that, everyone would have left. The Panthers weren't looking for any of the rest of us, just Charles Manson. So Charles Manson had to figure out how to turn Spahn Ranch into a fortress without letting anyone know the real reason. And then it came to him. The answer was right before his eyes. It was right there in the apocalyptic sermons he had used to spellbind the drug-enfeebled minds of the young men and women all the way back to the San Francisco days. Vaguely taken from the Bible, enhanced slowly over months and months to include Eastern mysticism, current social and political events, and even popular music. Charles Manson's prophecies about Armageddon now had a use other than to bemuse young, idealistic minds. This vague and varying prophecy had even found a name for itself among the revolutionary sounds of the Beatles' White Album, Helter Skelter. The kids loved it, and after 2 years of modifying the tale, Charles Manson could tell it with dramatic effect. It was perfect. The beautiful part about it was that any amount of arming and preparations could be covered by the explanation that they were preparing for Helter Skelter. And Charles Manson's constant talk of a black-white race war provided excellent cover for telling his young idealistic followers to keep an eye out for blacks sneaking around Spahn Ranch. It all worked to perfection. His long, repetitive sermons every night began to be remolded to reinforce the militant preparations. This is the time period when more and more guns began to appear at the ranch. This is also the time period when Manson had Bowie knives purchased, and all the women were told they were supposed to carry them at all times. An incredibly crafty bonus of Charles Manson's Helter Skelter story was that it really drew the family together. If facing an onslaught of Black Panthers, but if preparing for Armageddon, there would be no use in running away. Safety would be in friends and sticking together. To this day, Mr. Bugliosi is still very adamant Helter Skelter was the motive for the crimes. But I am tempted to believe this is now more out of personal pride than out of reason. Vincent Bugliosi made his name on this case, and to have to admit his motive might not have been correct, even after 37 years, might make his victory look a little less impressive. Nonetheless, there has been some evidence in the past years that even he is starting to accept that Helter Skelter was only a con to get people to do what Charles Manson wanted them to. The truth is, Charles Manson said whatever he had to whomever he had to get them to do what he wanted them to do. To some, he insisted the motive was Helter Skelter. That was what they responded to. For the more militant members of the family, the motive became revolution. To some, he made it sound like a religious trial. A bloodletting had to be born. The most ridiculous story to date is the one he told Sandra Good and Lynette Fromey, and which, incredibly, they still defend, that all the murders were committed as some sort of militant environmental protest. That's what they needed to believe in order to get them to go along. Predictably enough, none of these odd stories is what Manson told the male followers who were close to him and who shared his confidence during the drug dealing. I think the most decisive blow to the contention that Helter Skelter was the true motive for the killings was the fact that Charles Manson told these men he had just killed a panther and he needed money to split to the desert, and he needed it now. The reason I know this is because by the late summer of 1969, my son was over half a year old and I was becoming very attached to him. This was not allowed by Charles Manson. Mothers were kept away from their own children under the pretense that parents put too much guilt and structure on children and that they should be allowed to grow up free. In truth, it was an ironclad way of ensuring the mother would do whatever Charles Manson told her to. In my case, I became so persistent about seeing my son and trying to look after him that I was constantly being sent away from Spahn Ranch with the men when they went to take care of business. This not only meant I overheard things the other women didn't get a chance to, I was able to see how the explanations Charles Manson gave for what we were doing varied depending on who he was talking to. Specifically, I got to hear what he told the men, and he didn't waste their time with stories of Helter Skelter. One of the advantages of my being kept away from the main group at Spahn Ranch was that I was not subjected to the endless hours of Manson's sermons about preparing for the war to end all wars. This, coupled with knowing what the men knew about Crowe, allowed me to see the militant arming of the family during the end of 1969 in a little more disturbing light. And with the benefit of hindsight, this allows me to understand what went on in a way many of those who were in the family at the time still don't understand. So, Charles Manson told the story of Helter Skelter to the women and young people, and he told the truth to his right-hand men. But the lie was born, and slowly it took on a life of its own, and within the next year and a half, it would grow, and then turn on its creator, and wrap its tail around his neck, and squeeze the breath out of him. Chapter 9. Black Riders. Fate is sometimes extremely determined, and coincidence is sometimes suspiciously poignant. In Charles Manson's case, it seemed the book had been written and sealed with that one bullet he'd put in Bernard Crowe. As if he wasn't already scared for his very life, within the week a group of black people showed up at Spahn Ranch to rent horses. That's what George Spahn did at his ranch. He rented out horses to suburban families for an afternoon of fun. But to Charles Manson, this appeared to be an advance scouting party for the Panthers. He was terrified. I thought he was crazy. They were obviously just tourists up to rent horses, women and smiling children. But Charles Manson didn't see it that way. Looking back, it almost seems as though fate was giving Charles Manson one last good kick in the pants to push him over the edge and on the way to his inevitable downfall. That night, he called a meeting of his top men. He wanted money, and he wanted it now. Chapter 10. The Targeting of a Friend. I, of course, was not asked to the meeting. None of the women were. But once again, I had been forced away from my son and out to where the men met. Because of this, I was in the back room and within earshot when Charles Manson brought the subject up. He'd killed a panther, he said. They were coming to get him. He wanted out and wanted his protection, the entire family, to come with him. They mulled it over for a long time. No one had any money. If anyone they'd known had any money, they would have stole it long ago. Manson was desperate and getting angry. He was particularly angry with Charles Watson. Manson had done all this for him, he insisted. He'd gone to Crowe's place to protect them, to cover up for Watson's mistake. Now they had to do something to protect him. In truth, Manson hadn't gone to Crowe's place for anybody but himself. It was in the interest of keeping his identity hidden from the Panthers that Charles Manson shot Bernard Crowe. That he would try to make the other men feel guilty and imply that only Manson had the courage to do what had to be done was not below him at all. But it was Charles Manson himself who had pressured Watson and the others into drug deals. This is what ultimately led him to the confrontation with Bernard Crowe. In the final analysis, he could blame it on no one else. It should also be mentioned that the reason why Charles Manson couldn't find anyone in all of Los Angeles who was willing to loan or give him enough money to flee, or to put him up for a while until the heat died down, was because by the summer of 1969, Charles Manson had abused the friendship of everyone who'd ever tried to help him. He'd robbed some of these people, stolen from others, threatened others when they didn't give him what he wanted, and shamelessly lived off others until he'd abused his welcome everywhere. No one who had anything worth taking wanted him anywhere near them. Finally, the men at the meeting were reduced to grabbing at the faintest of straws. Bobby Beausoleil thought he remembered someone saying a friend of the family's, a music teacher named Gary Hinman, had inherited a lot of money. This didn't seem very likely to me. Gary lived in a little place down Topanga Canyon. Nothing fancy, but that's all they could come up with. Charles Manson said that Hinman was practically part of the family, or at least he could be convinced to join the family. If he joined the family, he could be expected to turn his inheritance over. Since this was all they could come up with, they decided to try it. Later, it became quite obvious Manson didn't really care if Hinman joined the family, as long as Manson got his money. Chapter 11. The Killing of a Friend. So, it was decided that Bobby Beausoleil would ask Gary to join the family. Bobby was probably picked as the one to approach Gary for a couple of reasons. Gary Hinman taught guitar, and he'd shown both Beausoleil and Manson some techniques, so Bobby already knew him pretty well. What's more, there was talk that Gary might have been gay and was attracted to Bobby. I don't know if this was true. It may all have been in Manson's imagination. Nonetheless, this may also have influenced the decision to choose Bobby as the one to try to persuade Gary to join the family. But there may be another reason Bobby was chosen. Gary and Manson were both the tentative leaders of the family. At the time Manson met Bobby, Bobby already had a small family of his own, including Leslie Van Houten, Catherine Scher, and several other girls. Since Bobby Beausoleil was ultimately arrested prior to the Tate-LaBianca crimes, people often forget he was also a leader of the family, and there was something of a power struggle between him and Manson. This competitive relationship would have allowed Manson to insinuate to Bobby that he, Manson, had done his part by intercepting Crowe, and now Bobby had to show he was an active leader as well. It was also a way of assuring Bobby dirtied his hands, making it less likely he'd be willing to testify against Manson about Crowe. Manson chose to send Mary Brunner and me along as well. This is probably partly because Gary Hinman knew both Mary and me, and he would be comfortable with us. But I'm convinced it was also because Mary and I had infant sons back at Spawn Ranch. Sons who could be used to prevent us from going to the police if anything happened. And I think Manson knew something was going to happen. Forgetting I was in the back room when he had been talking to the men, or perhaps not aware I had heard him, Manson told Mary and me we were going with Bobby to pick up some money Gary owed Manson. At the time, I found it hard to believe Gary had any money at all, but off we went. I had grave misgivings about the trip. A day or two earlier, Manson had approached me and challenged me to go down and kill Gary. If I hadn't overheard the conversation of the night before, I would have assumed it was one of his mind games. Would you die for me? I would die for you. Would you kill for me? He started the conversation by suggesting that I wasn't a leader or a doer, that I should just stay in the background. He knew this would get to me. An expert at manipulation, he knew I strove for attention and validation. He knew that suggesting I learn to stay in the background would grate on me and make me want to prove him wrong. I could tell he was trying to goad me. That he suggested killing Gary Hinman, even with a joking smile, struck me with fear. Charles Manson often used these kinds of little games to test people. If he was just testing me, I would have to play up to him. But what if he wasn't just testing me? I told Manson I wouldn't kill Gary, and he had laughed and walked away as though it was all just a mind game. But the episode left me very wary about the trip to Gary's. In the end, my worst fears were realized. Gary Hinman, a music teacher, a practicer of transcendental meditation, a pacifist with a truly gentle spirit who had gone out of his way to befriend and help Charles Manson and the family, was killed for refusing to give up money, which it turned out he never had. The senselessness, callous nature of this killing will never cease to grieve and dumbfound me. What made this so cruel was that Gary Hinman had befriended Charles Manson about a year ago, while helping to provide food and clothing for Manson's newborn son by Mary Brunner. Gary Hinman had even allowed Mary Brunner to use his address with the social services instead of the dilapidated ranch, so they wouldn't take Manson's son away from her. The extent to which drugs can befuddle the mind and destroy one's priorities is incredible. In hindsight, the death of Gary is perhaps the hardest thing to understand or make sense of. After Gary declined to join the family, and after he insisted he'd inherited no money, Bobby pulled a gun out, to the surprise of Mary and me, and demanded the money. When Gary continued to deny he had any, even after Bobby beat him up, Manson arrived with Bruce Davis and became so enraged he tried to cut Gary's head off with his machete. Manson missed, but severed Gary's earlobe and opened up a cut along the side of his face. Manson left, ordering Mary and me to stay behind and nurse Gary back to health. After a couple days, it became obvious Gary certainly didn't have any money. Bobby was on the phone several times in heated discussions with Manson, but I never knew what they were talking about. On the third day, Bobby ordered Mary and me into the back of the kitchen, and he went out into the living room where Gary was and killed him. Bobby then told us to wipe the house down to remove any fingerprints. Bobby took Gary's car and drove us back to Spawn Ranch. What continues to puzzle me, even after all these years, is what Charles Manson said to Bobby Beausoleil on the phone that led Bobby to kill Gary. I will never know, but I can guess. I imagine Manson had suggested Bobby be the one to go get the money from Gary because Charles Manson knew if push came to shove, he could remind Beausoleil that he, Manson, had already killed someone in the name of the family. That Bobby had been beat over the head all week long about how only Charles Manson had the guts to take care of Bernard Crowe can easily be imagined. After challenging and shaming Beausoleil for the better part of a week, Manson sent him off to Gary's. It's impossible to tell, but there are several reasons to think that Manson had intended for Gary to be killed from the beginning. For one thing, Manson's attack on Gary, whether lethal or not, assured that Gary would have gone to the police as soon as he was left alone. Even if Gary hadn't wanted to, he could not have turned up at an emergency ward with that injury without the police being called. Manson must have known that. The fact that Manson sent Mary Brunner and me with Bobby is also interesting. On one side was the fact that Gary Hinman knew and liked all three of us. That Charles Manson picked friendly faces to try to talk Gary out of his money cannot be a mistake. But on the other side, it bears pointing out that Mary Brunner and I were the only women at Spawn Ranch with babies. Linda Kasabian hadn't arrived with her daughter yet. This cannot have been a mistake either. That these children were kept away from us and guarded was well known, as was Manson's penchant for using them to persuade us to do what's best for you and the children. That Mary and I wouldn't flee the family or talk, no matter what happened at Gary's, was assured as long as Manson had our children. And finally, if Bobby killed Gary, then Manson would have something on Bobby that would assure that Bobby wouldn't tell anyone that Manson had killed Bernard Crowe. Bobby's hand would be dirty too. The crime was poorly thought out, but the manipulation was flawless. There's one other thing worth noting at this point. Remember when I said Charles Manson had made a terrific mistake when shooting Bernard Crowe? In part because so many people at Spawn Ranch knew he'd gone to Crowe's that day, and there were almost a dozen people who could corroborate any accusations against him. And remember I said he formulated a plan to protect himself? Well, I think this was the plan. If Charles Manson had his hands dirty, then he was going to make sure everyone got their hands dirty. This is a pattern that continued over the next couple months. When Manson heard that I wasn't able to hold the gun on Gary Hinman, Charles Manson made sure that I was included in the Cielo Drive murders. When he heard that Linda Kasabian had run from the Cielo Drive murders, Charles Manson made sure she was included on the night of the LaBianca murders. He shamed Bobby Beausoleil into committing the Hinman murder by pointing out that he, Charles Manson, had already shot Bernard Crowe, ostensibly for the family. Then he shamed or psyched Charles Watson into the Cielo LaBianca killings by pointing to the sacrifice that he and Bobby Beausoleil had made for the family with the Hinman murder, ostensibly to cover up Watson's mistake with Crowe. He then psyched out Steve Grogan into the Shea murder by pointing to Bobby Beausoleil and Watson. One by one, everyone was dirtied, until no one was left to finger Manson.